Magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the first 10th edition quarterly rules update to Warhammer 40k. Now, for those of you who are new to the hobby, you may not know that GW has committed to quarterly rules updates, which are mostly points updates, but also involve some rules tinkering. And the reason that these exist is to try to maintain some kind of game balance, while also accepting that true game balance is impossible. The flip side of an incredibly customizable game with over 1,000 data sheets and so many different factions is that it's not feasible to have all of those play into one another with an equal chance of victory with virtually any list. You can't do that. But Games Workshop is making a more concerted effort than ever before, and I think with more success than ever before, at trying to effect some kind of balance on the table, even if my heart still goes out to you Advent players. Okay, so Aeldari players have been waiting for this one with some concern because we have been in everybody's crosshairs since the editions started. The presence of the Wraith Knight in the picture accompanying this update on the Warhammer community page, I think, emphasizes and underlines the fact that Craft Worlds are probably the most complained about faction in 10th edition in the first weeks. And so we all knew that Space Elves were going to get reined in, and they have been. Partially with changes to point costs, and more so with changes to how fate dice work. I will talk about both of these, but I'm going to start with fate dice. So now, the way fate dice work, you still get the same number of fate dice. You get the 12, you can re-roll them, and then you'll have 11 and so on. But now you are limited to the use of one die per phase. One die per phase per player turn. So many of us thought that it might go to one die per unit per phase. What I thought they would do was reduce the number of fate dice and limit it to one die per unit. So you could have multiple shooting units use a single die to modify something, and that is not what they have done. So you can no longer, on turn one, decide that your Wraith Knight automatically hits Magnus the Red, automatically wounds Magnus the Red, and automatically inflicts d6 plus 6 mortal wounds on Magnus the Red. Now, some of you are freaking out because you are under the impression that mortal wounds cannot be affected with fate dice. They can. They could before, and they still can, and this was made clear in the designer's commentary. If you check out this document, on either page 4 or 5, it makes clear. So, okay, let me just back up a bit. So, when you roll a 6 for a weapon that inflicts devastating wounds, the wounds that are inflicted are mortal wounds. And originally there was some speculation that because if you're rolling for the number of mortal wounds, that's not a straight up damage roll. So obviously you wouldn't be able to use a fate die to affect it. But if you read the rules commentary, they make clear that damage roll refers to modifications to determining what the damage characteristic is. So it's not a damage roll that happens after you hit per se. It's just figuring out what the damage characteristic is. That's on page 4 or 5. And then on page, I think 17 or 18, it explains that modifying a damage characteristic in devastating wounds, when a roll modifies an attack's damage characteristic, if that attack scores a critical wound, the damage characteristic is modified before the damage is applied as mortal wounds. So something like the Avatar of Cain would still have incoming damage even if it converts to mortal wounds. Something like a Wraith Knight would still reduce it, but that also means you have to know what the damage characteristic is, so it's already determined. So you do the damage characteristic roll, you modify it with the fate die, and then it becomes mortal wounds. It was ambiguous before, I absolutely grant that, but now with the designer commentary, really it isn't. But you can no longer, as I started saying before, you can no longer shoot something with the Wraith Knight like Magnus the Red, auto hit, automatically do devastating wounds, and then automatically push through an average of 9 or 10 mortal wounds with that one shot. You cannot do that. Instead, you have to decide, are you automatically hitting? That's not what you're going to do. Are you going to do devastating wounds? Or when you wound Magnus, are you going to make sure that you roll well? And the probable answer is going to be that you do devastating wounds, so that you do mortals, so you go through invulnerable saves and whatever else. But now that it's one model per phase, you cannot. It changes the relative value of everything, because you can't guarantee that the Avatar's Wailing Doom is going to do, when you shoot something with it, 1 plus D3 auto hits with its sustained hits ability, because if you do that, then you're not doing mortal wounds with your Wraith Cannon or with your D Cannon or whatever it is. So you're going to have to decide, and it's maybe going to be a little bit less valuable to have quite as many of those types of units in a list as it was before. It also changes the relative value of units like Eldred or Guardian Defenders. Eldred gives you 3 additional dice. Well, I don't know that you really need 3 additional dice now. If you can't stack their use in the early game. It's not bad. He's got Doom. He's still good. He's definitely not nearly as good as he was before. The Guardian Defenders, which for me were pretty much an auto include, I think now are not an auto include. They're still good. The ability to generate more dice is still good. You can absolutely still go through 12 dice in a game. But this change is seriously reined in your ability to do a turn 1 alpha strike, where you just absolutely cripple your opponent's army. And because of the towering keyword on the Wraith Knight, which we'll talk about, and because of the indirect fire and the D cannon, there's just in the speed of the fire prisms, there's like nothing your opponent can do about it. And that's not true anymore. Now, I am about to say something that is going to generate some hate in the comments, and no doubt earn me the ire of some of you, and that makes me sad. I do these videos for free for the community, and so angry comments or highly critical comments always, they take the wind out of my sails a bit. Makes me sad, but I'm still gonna tell you what I think, and what I think is that these changes are reasonable, and that Craft Worlds are still going to be a strong faction. They're still going to appear on the podium at big tournaments. They're still going to have at least better than 50% win rate. They're still very good. I actually kind of like this. Oh, I know how upsetting that's going to be for some of you. Here's why I think it's okay. First of all, the early tournament data, I think I mentioned before. I started making this video and then it started raining like the world was ending and I had to restart it. So maybe I said it in my first cut, but the early tournament data definitely was showing issues with Craft Worlds on podiums, and certainly in my own games of 10th edition. My ability to table my opponent on turn 3 or 4 was embarrassing. So I think that this is reasonable, especially because we still have really good data cards, a really good faction ability, and you can still use fate dice to do a lot of the things you were doing before, like auto succeeding on Overwatch with like Bright Lances and Fire Prisms, which is incredibly powerful. You just can't auto kill. You can't say to your opponent on turn 1, I don't have to roll any dice and take Magnus the Red off the table. He's automatically dead, which frankly is just that's not good for the game. It's a real feel bad moment for your opponent. Yes, they could put Magnus into reserve, but come on, there's no way around the fact that having a power that your opponent can't play around, that doesn't require you to do anything tactically clever, and there's no way for them to outthink, is that is too powerful a resource. And yes, they could have gone to 1 die per unit per phase instead, and maybe given us fewer dice, more like Sisters. I think that what they've done and giving us all 12 dice, but making us vary how we use them, I think it is more interesting tactically. I think it's better for gameplay, and I think that it will do a better job of discouraging Alpha Strike, which I do not think that Alpha Strike is generally good for the game. Alpha Strike for those newer players is when you rely on doing so much crippling damage to your opponent's list on either turn 1, the bottom of turn 1 or the top of turn 2, that they can never bounce back from it and the game is basically over. partially because a lot of Alpha Strike lists are rock, paper, scissors lists. It's like there are things that beat them, but oftentimes Alpha Strike lists are they either automatically beat something or they don't. And that isn't fun for an opponent. It's not 40K living its best life. Let's put it that way. So I kind of like that now in the shooting phase, I get to decide that somewhere on the table, like maybe my Wraith Knight or my D-Cannon or whatever is going to do with this one shot, I'm going to do devastating wounds. That's what I'm doing. Or maybe that's what I was planning to do, but I wounded something with a Bright Lance and I decide to just automatically do 8 damage with the Bright Lance because the thing that I'm shooting doesn't have an invulnerable save. One change to the way that we play this is going to be you're going to want to probably hold back that fate die in the shooting phase on your turn until you'll need to be much smarter about the order in which you do things to decide where you can best use it. So I'm going to shoot this thing with my Bright Lance. If I wound it, because this thing doesn't have the invuln save, then I'm going to do 8 damage here. If that doesn't work, then I'm going to trigger devastating wounds over here, but not knowing for sure what the devastating wounds roll will be. In case I whiff on that, I also have to not have fired with these other units yet. It makes the tactical decision making really interesting. It also encourages us to have a better mix of shooting and melee. Like Craftworld's shooting is really powerful. Maybe actually getting something like your avatar stuck into melee earlier, so that you have opportunities to use offensive dice multiple times on your turn. You're more likely to use one of these things on a charge roll. We still can automatically succeed on Overwatch fire, but then having to roll normally to wound and not being able to push through mortal wounds in the Overwatch phase seems totally reasonable to me. On the other hand, you can still make sure that your D-Cannon does D6 plus 2 damage mortal wounds to some infantry unit and use a D-Cannon to pick up a bunch of infantry. So many of the tricks that Eldar have in this edition that are really powerful are still available to us. We just don't get them endlessly. And you have to think, instead of thinking about how I'm going to cripple my opponent on turn 1, I have to think how I'm going to build lists that can make use of these dice over the whole game, right? And I think that's cool. I think that's interesting. I probably don't need 15 of them now. Maybe Eldred is a bit less appealing. Guardian Defenders, I probably would rather have Storm Guardians now. I like sticky objectives. But again, we still have really, really powerful shooting. Our low volume, because of our special detachment rule, reroll 1 roll to hit, reroll 1 wound roll. Our low volume of fire units, like Warwalkers with Bright Lances, like D-Cannons, still are going to be re-rolling, probably in general, they're going to be re-rolling like all of their misses and all of their failed wounds. And that's incredibly powerful. Fire Prisms just straight up automatically do it. There's a way to make it happen anyway. All of your failed, I explained it in another video. Look at the data card. If you think about the faction re-roll that they have with the Prism Cannon, you basically have full re-rolls. We still have really good shooting, and we can still auto hit something with a super powerful weapon on Overwatch at the end of our opponent's movement phase. And we're going to have to maybe think even more about setting that up if we can't do it all in our shooting phase. We can still really mess something up in melee. We can still succeed on charges. I think that the sleeper effect here, which I think is a good effect, and probably part of the reason that GW decided to make it 1 unit per phase, or one die per phase instead of 1 die per unit per phase, is Eldar are now back to being reasonably fragile again. The ability to just lean into the dice to succeed on saving throws, especially on some of your 4s with your invulnerable saves, was super powerful. It was so you could really. I had a game in which an opponent threw everything at my Wraith Knight, and I used 6 or 7 dice to save, and it was still up despite having been blasted by almost everything in his army. I can't do that anymore, and I think that's good. I think Eldar should require careful, tactical, duck and cover, survivalist play, not in a pinch, I have 15 fate dice with Eldred and I'm generating more every turn, so I shrug off all your... It doesn't matter if you have 6 las cannons. I shrug them all out. That kind of thing. I think it's not good for the game, and I think that it also doesn't make a huge amount of narrative sense. So I think these changes are good. I think Eldar is still going to be really powerful. I think they've left a lot of the Fate Dice tricks in place. We just have to be more judicious about how we use them and think about building more varied and complicated lists that don't just like have overwhelming shooting power on turn one and that's it. That said, there is another way that Eldari's shooting power has been reined in, and this is a way in which lots of factions have been reined in. So units with the towering keyword and with indirect fire have gotten significant points increases. So this has hit, in most cases, this has hit the Wraith Knight, the Night Spinner, and the D Cannon for Eldar. But it's hit a lot of other factions too, like other towering knights have gotten big points increases. Space Marine Desolators have gotten a significant points bump. So now if someone wants to run 30 of these things, it's more than half their list. A lot of us were worried about Space Marine Indirect Fire. It's really powerful. And in general, I think the Indirect Fire and the towering keyword create the same problem for the game that front-loading Fate Dice was creating, and that is that it takes choices away from your opponent, and it makes a lot of their tactical decision-making not matter much. Yes, you can put things into reserve. Stop getting mad, random listener in Michigan. I'm aware of that, but you know what I mean. If your opponent has enough indirect fire on turn one to be able to just like wipe out the infantry in your backfield or pick up a tank no matter what you do, and it's impossible to hide things, it's kind of feel bad. You know, it's that thing I mentioned before where it's not that your opponent is outplaying you or that you've made a mistake. It's just there's this like rock, paper, scissors power that they have. And indirect fire lists, which got sort of carried away in 8th and early 9th edition before GW introduced the nerf whereby they're always -1 to hit. It was a bit different last edition, but now they're always -1 to hit. You always get the benefit of cover when you're being targeted with indirect fire. That turned out in this edition, partially because they've scaled that nerf back a bit, which I talked about in an earlier video, but that turned out to not be enough. And so now they're giving points increases to these units that can do this, because it's just a feel bad moment when your opponent has this list that either essentially beats yours or it doesn't. And it's almost a foregone conclusion at the beginning of the game or before anybody moves a model or rolls a die. Now, for those of you who haven't been following the rules super closely, the reason that I group towering here, so the really big war machines, the titans, the enormous models that look like they could be for some other game because they're just so big, they have the towering keyword, which, like in earlier editions, means that any model that has true line of sight to them, even if there's obscuring terrain in the way, can target them. And what true line of sight means for you newer players is that if you get down near the table and you peer from some point on that model, you can see the other model. It's not literally invisible because it's behind something. Terrain pieces that have the obscuring keyword that in some abstract way block line of sight don't affect towering models. This was true in previous editions when it came to targeting big models, but what's true now is that it works two ways. So towering models can also target things completely behind obscuring terrain if they have true line of sight to them at all. And this was important for knights. Knights were just at this like inherent disadvantage because they, if they can't shoot you and you can shoot them, it's an issue. And I think that everybody thought that GW would fiddle with towering as a keyword, like change in some way what it did, and they didn't. Instead, they have addressed it with points changes. So the Wraith Knight has gone for this. Here's what this means for Eldar. Let me start with what's good for Eldar. Eldar infantry are very, very fragile and really easy to pick up with indirect fire. And so our indirect fire units got more expensive, but so did everybody else's, which means the infantry units in our backfield are a bit more safe and a bit more viable. And this is going to be important in a moment. The flip side, of course, is that the support platforms have gone from 85 to 105, right? 105 points. That's a pretty significant points upgrade. And add to that the fact that you can't, you're not necessarily using fate dice with them because maybe you want to use those fate dice somewhere else when they target things. They're not they're not as good. They're still very good. I am still going to run one of these things. I do think that the D cannon with that points uptick, the D cannon is probably now the only viable one, really. Unless you're doing something really tricky with the Shadow Weaver, with its special ability. But for most of us, I think the D cannon is now the only viable one, and we're not running 3. Probably somebody's going to, and it'll do great. The Wraith Knight has gone from 370 to 475. That's a pretty big increase. I'm just going to come out and say it. The Wraith Knight is still good. It's still good. It's still competitive. It's still going to appear in lists that do really well at big tournaments. What I don't think we're necessarily going to see is 3 of them. I will say, though, I think the Melee Wraith Knight was already struggling, and now I think the Melee Wraith Knight is dead. The Melee Wraith Knight is the Wraith Knight with the sword and shield, and it was not benefiting from towering. It was only being hurt by, yes, it could have shoulder mount and scatter lasers, but whatever, shoulder mounted. One of the problems with making all of the different iterations of a thing cost the same points is you sometimes end up in this situation where nerfing the Wraith Cannon with the enormous cannons, the Wraith Knight with the enormous cannons, has the unfortunate side effect of also nerfing the Sword and Shield Knight, because you can't have different point values for them these days for some reason. I don't think that model was like borderline kind of viable before, and now it compares so poorly to the Avatar of Cain that there's no reason to consider ever taking it in anything other than the most casual fun games. And in the most casual fun games, it'll still be a lot of fun. The Forge World Wraith Knight the Scaffic Wraith Knight has also gone similarly up in points. I think it still doesn't quite compare favorably to the regular Knight, which does devastating wounds, and so is just better because you can still use a fate die to trigger devastating wounds somewhere. So it's 2d6 mortal wounds is no joke. The Night Spinner has gone to 170 points. That feels like a big ouch to me. Some people are using them very effectively, or were using them very effectively. I think that there's still an argument for a Night Spinner or 2 in a list. I think that Elf Indirect Fire is still good, but it certainly changes things a bit. On the other hand, the Dark Reapers did not, despite having pretty good indirect fire, did not get a points increase. So a unit of Dark Reapers is still 75 points, and you can still give the Exarch the Tempest Launcher and throw some buffs on there, and it's pretty good. Also, now that everybody else's indirect fire is a bit more expensive and they're likely not to have as much of it, your Reapers are less likely to just be killed on turn 1, and yes, you could start them in reserve. I honestly think that a squad of 75-point Reapers as an early game indirect fire tool and maybe a late game move into line of sight and do stuff unit is not bad, especially now that our shooting is not going to be all about triggering tons of Strands of Fate dice on turn 1. So we do have this indirect fire option that was weirdly untouched, even though I think it was already reasonably aggressively pointed. So I think Reapers might be, I'm not suggesting that they're auto includes or anything, but I think Reapers are one of kind of like the weird winners in this whole thing. And lastly, the Fire Prism has gone to 150 points. Everybody knew that the Fire Prism was going to go up. Lots of people speculated that it would go to 160 or to 180. I thought 160 would be reasonable. So I think at 150, it's like, that's good. I think that tank was undercosted. If you look at similar tanks from other factions, especially given that it rerolls everything, I think the Prism is still a bargain at 150, but it also makes it reasonable to start considering things like the Lynx, which, even though it was really good before, it was really hard to justify the Lynx at 155 when the Prism was like 120 or whatever. But like when the Prism is 150, now maybe there's room in your list, especially if you want something that's going to zip into if not the center of the table, certainly somewhere deeper onto your opponent's side of the board to be able to trigger Overwatch fire so that you're able to use more of those Fate dice for shooting. In some ways, I think these changes, both to Strands of Fate and also to point values, have liberated Craft Worlds players into being allowed in competitive play to use a bunch of units that are good, but were just like, because of the synergies created by Strands of Fate and because of the just incredible discount on stuff like the Fire Prism and the Wraith Knight, it was maybe a little bit harder to find room. And just again, for those of you who are upset by the fact that I am not upset by these changes, I just want to say my own out of the gate competitive list is now like 235, 240 points over 2,000 points. Like, it's been completely pointed out. So it's not like I don't have to totally redesign my lists or anything. I just think that it's going to be refreshing to not have people hate us as soon as we get our armies out and of our bags, or say something like, oh, of course you're playing Eldar. Which especially rankles me because I was playing Craft Worlds back when they were the like ugly, unloved stepchildren of late 8th and early 9th edition, when they were largely unplayable competitively. Yes, Mark Vickery, you were doing great with them. Good job, Mark Vickery. But most of us were really having a tough time. So it's always a bit of a bummer when somebody suggests that our love of space elves is actually not a love of space elves at all, but some desire to auto win at the table. And I think that with these changes to the rules, our opponents will dislike us less, and that will make the game more fun. And I really do think that it's opened up a lot of interesting tactical decision making and much more varied list building, which is just good. It's good for my play experience. It's good for your play experience. It's good for the game. And so that's what I've got. I think that the units that are good for Craft Worlds, or were good before, are still good. There are now other units that are also good because they're not so automatically outclassed by some overpowered, undercosted things. I think that we need to think more carefully about how we're going to use our Fate dice over 5 turns, not front load them in 1 turn, which I also think is much more Aeldari, because it forces you to have an eye on distance events and not simply rely on bulldozing your opponent in the here and now. And I continue to believe that the data cards are good enough, and there are enough of them, and the index is deep enough that we are still going to be finding new and interesting ways to play our Space Elves when we eventually get our codex. And I think that is more true because of these changes. Although those of you who just ordered 3, who had no Wraith Knights, and you've just ordered 3 of them online, my heart does go out to you. I understand why that's frustrating, but I've had 3 Wraith Knights for a long time without them being good, and really enjoyed playing them in casual games. You can certainly still put 3 Wraith Knights on the table and have a good time with them. And the fact remains that if you're trying to be really competitive in 40K, you can't rely on just buying one army that is very competitive and then get mad in 6 months when the meta changes. If you're trying to play like tournament level competitive 40K, then yeah, you do have to keep. It is true that the stuff that was highly competitive 6 months ago is not going to continue to be exactly the same models. It's part of the hobby, but I sympathize. I do. I never got to play with the Emperor's Children list that I made for late 9th edition, finishing my last 5 Noise Moraines, and that Dark Apostle just isn't what he once was. So, empathize. Okay, I'll be back again soon with some kind of content. I don't know what it's going to be. Maybe I'll start in on faction focus videos. Maybe I'll do something on the new mission cards. I think that's probably going to need to be the priority. Obviously, the way that we score is very different. So I think a deep dive on that might be in order next. If you liked this video, I hope that you will click a like. If you have not yet subscribed, I hope that you will consider subscribing. And if you have not left a comment, I hope that you will leave a comment. I hope it won't be too terribly angry. And a special thank you to all of my patrons. If you're interested in becoming a patron, I will link it in the video description. They get early access to content, the ability to download audio files like a podcast, and access to Discord, which is active and delightful. Okay, take care. Best wishes with your Space Elves. Back soon. Bye.